My name is Allie Futty. I'm a teacher of the visually impaired, a certified orientation and mobility specialist, and a certified assistive technology instructional specialist for people with visual impairments. I am currently the program manager for the Northeast Resource Center for Vision Education at UMass Boston. And today I want to talk a little bit about assistive technology and CVI and what I think you might need to know about that topic.
Part 2, AT assessment.
It all starts with assessment. So while OSEP, the Office of Special Education Programs, has clarified that a student does not require an evaluation before an AT solution is selected. An evaluation is often the best course of action. So an example of a situation that OSEP gives, or maybe a full evaluation isn't required, is something like the team determines that this child would benefit from a graphic organizer to help them organize their thinking in class. That maybe doesn't require a full evaluation, but anytime you're going to get into making decisions around selecting and configuring devices and making instructional plans, you really want to think about an assessment. So AT assessment with learners with CVI. Every child with CVI is so unique that a carefully planned assessment of the AT needs of the child is critical. You can never say, quote, I had a student with CVI before and fill in the blank worked for them. Every child is so unique. You cannot just throw a device onto a child with CVI because it worked for a previous child with CVI in that district. While children with CVI are unique learners, principles that apply to assessment for all learners with visual impairments hold true. Assessment must take place in the customary environment. Before beginning the AT assessment, understand the flow of that child's day. And I'll just give a little bit of an example here, what I'm talking about when I talk about customary environment. So you don't want to take the child with CVI, which happens with all kids across the board with visual impairments, and take them into some separate room they've never been in before and do a whole AT evaluation on them, and then throw them, back into the wild with a device that doesn't work for them. You really have to understand, where is this child going to be using this device, under what conditions is the device going to be used? And then understand the flow of the child's day is also important, because my little embarrassing story is I once did this whole AT assessment on this student. We went to the customary environment where the child was going to be needing to use this device, which was in the library. And I was like, great, let's go to the library. I'm going to the customary environment. Well, I didn't really know the student's schedule. And what I didn't realize when we chose the solution was that the actual time the child was going to be in the library was a time where the whole second grade was in there. And so in the quiet, controlled environment of the library, they could use their solution really well. But as soon as you brought the whole second grade class in there, that student just could not use that setup anymore. And so I learned that lesson the hard way. Hopefully I'll impart to you that, you really have to understand where that child is in the flow of their day before you can really make that quality customary environment consideration. While the process may be the same for all children with visual impairments, the barriers are different. So one example of that, between maybe a child with an ocular visual impairment and a cortical visual impairment who doesn't also have an ocular visual impairment, is, does this child need large print? You might consider that for a child with an ocular visual impairment. For a child with CVI, you might consider, how can I leverage technology to reduce visual complexity? So this is just, sort of a list here of the next few slides are going to be kind of what I consider to be the general best practices that you should be thinking about when kind of trying to pull together an assistive technology assessment. So you're going to make sure you assemble a quality team. The team should include individuals highly knowledgeable about the child's individual characteristics. Nobody should be doing an assessment in a vacuum. The TVI is an essential part of the team, in my opinion. I hope that every child with CVI has a CVI competent teacher, the visually impaired, on their team. Well-trained TVIs should have the content knowledge needed to help guide the team regarding the child's visual impairment. If the child has additional disabilities, be sure to include all service providers, such as speech and language pathologists, occupational therapists, their physical therapist, if they have a behavior interventionist. Everybody should be involved in that conversation. Remember that parents are critical members of the team. So all the parents out there, please advocate for yourselves that you are a critical member of this evaluation team. While they may not take place in the direct assessment, they are critical, they have critical information about the child. So parent involvement is the single greatest indicator of success with technology for children with visual impairments. That's research that was done by Dr. Stacy Kelly at Northern Illinois University that very clearly shows that we really strongly want to make sure that parents understand how to use the technology and they understand the purpose of their children's technology. While this study was done on children with ocular visual impairments, I see no reason why that same concept wouldn't hold true for all students with visual impairments. It's really important to consider the role of the end user when you're assembling the team. So the end user or the student is the most important member of the team and often the most forgotten, right? So there's usually a lot of adults talking, a lot of technical information, making decisions for students, and forgetting that really the end user is the most important member of the team. AT assessment must begin and end with the student always. The student should be involved throughout the process to the greatest extent possible. That's going to be different for every student, but I personally have never met a student that can't participate in the assessment in some way, beyond just being directly assessed. Can indicate some preferences, or something along those lines. Personal preference really matters. Sometimes, as adults, we get in our minds, this student needs to be able to do or needs to use this device because we think it might be the best one. But it's really important that we incorporate the actual desires of the student into that conversation. From a fairly young age, children with CVI need to be empowered through self-determination. And I like this phrase that I often say, which is the dignity of risk is a human right. And what that means to me is that a student, may choose a device that meets the assessment requirements, but isn't the optimal device that the adult might have chosen. And as long as it meets the requirements of what the team determines would best support the student, go with the student's preference, because how else are they going to learn that maybe that other device would have actually been a bit better if they don't actually have the experience with the device that you are hoping they might not choose. And so, all humans are entitled to make risks, to have their preferences be heard and known, and have some piece of self-determination in the conversation. If you are a person without a visual impairment, you should stay especially sensitive to the preferences of the end user, and make sure to maintain a community of practice, which includes adults with visual impairment and CVI more specifically. While I happen to be an AT trainer with a visual impairment, oftentimes these decisions are being made on teams where there isn't a single person who's ever experienced visual impairment. And that doesn't mean that their expertise is invalid, that they don't have a really important voice, they can't deeply understand the needs of students with visual impairments. That being said, if you've never actually day in and day out had to carry these devices around, configure them, use them, keep them charged, it's really important to make sure that you're continually feeding yourself with the voices of, adults with visual impairment and CVI who can provide that context for you. So once you have the team, you want to make sure you're reviewing all the relevant medical data and beyond for the student. So for a student with CVI, you might want to look at, this is not a comprehensive list, but you might want to review the medical eye exam, a neurological exam, a functional vision evaluation, a neuropsychological test, if any of it has been performed, general medical reports, educational testing, learning media assessment, IEP, education data such as grades, work products, standardized testing, scores. That would all be a part of kind of the file review and considering all the data you already have on the student. One more note on that actually is I just want to point out the functional vision evaluation and learning media assessment. From my perspective, every child with CVI should have a quality functional vision evaluation and learning media assessment. And if you don't have those two things already in place, you really need to collaborate with a teacher visually impaired who's competent in CVI to complete those two evaluations because it's going to be really hard to make decisions about assistive technology. One, if you don't understand the child's functional vision, and then also if you don't know what the child's preferred learning media is, because oftentimes these technologies are specifically tied to particular learning medias. So that would be, for example, learning media assessment. If you're not as familiar with that, that would be that there's been a determination, is the student a print user, a braille user, an auditory access user? Are they some combination of all three? So just making sure that those determinations have been considered. The AT assessment process can happen in conjunction with those two other processes as well. So once you've considered all the, you've got the team, you've read all of the relevant information about the student, you want to start collecting some data. So, and again, I'm putting this all caps because have you noticed we haven't even talked about the devices yet, right? So oftentimes the first IEP meeting, people pull together and they're like, okay, what devices have you seen online? What looks cool? Haven't even gotten there yet in the conversation. Some data that you want to collect is what environments does the student occupy across their day? Careful evaluation of these environments is critical during the time the student would be in those environments. And I talked about my own story a little bit ago. What tools are currently available to student? Are they successful? What's the student's current workflow? What modifications or adaptations are already in place for the student? And then you want to make sure you're collecting data through observations, interviews, and direct assessment of the student where appropriate. You want to make sure you're considering the tasks that are creating barriers for the student. So you have to look for students with visual impairment in both the core curriculum and the expanded core curriculum. So their academic piece and then all those other pieces that fall under the expanded core curriculum for students with visual impairments, things like their independent living skills, their ability to safely travel in the environment, any compensatory skills related to the visual impairment, what tasks take significantly longer than sighted peers. Those are good tasks to look at for assistive technology. Do not forget to consider tasks that a child is technically completing, but with a lot of adult support. That is not independence. So we need to think about any of those places. If an adult is doing the majority of the task, we need to think, okay, how can we get the student in a place where they can do more of the task? They will do it when they get older is not a good excuse. Students will not have the prerequisite skills they needed to complete the task later. We cannot wait for a child's visual functioning to improve to integrate them into their day. So sometimes, that will be something that I hear at the school. Oh, someday, we're going to work really hard on this kid's visual functioning and they'll be able to, then they'll be able to participate in the classroom. For any student with a visual impairment, regardless of what their level of visual functioning is at any particular time, they deserve and have a right to full inclusion in the classroom. And so we have to take that student in the moment that they are and think about, okay, what supports do we need for this student in the moment that they are so that they have full access to the classroom. You want to make sure you're considering both current and future needs. So we want to create a roadmap for students. We need to consider where they're now, but also project into adulthood. We want to keep students on pace with peers to the greatest extent possible. Again, every student is really, really unique, but we want to feel as good as possible about a roadmap that we've set for a student. We don't want to just be necessarily living day to day with them. So the next step that you've done all of this observation and collected all this data is that you want to start matching those student needs that you've evaluated with the tech and trial it. So this is the point that you start getting to talk about the tools and not before. That's my big thing, because I never want people to be influenced by technology that they have in their mind. and allow that to influence the data that they're collecting. So this is the moment that it's so fun. The team gets to bring all their data together and say, okay, here's all the barriers we're seeing. What kinds of devices might help start to solve those barriers? So learning media assessments and functional vision evaluations are critical at this point. Understand your students' sensory learning channels and how they relate to different environments across the day. Talked about that a little bit previously. Once appropriate tool types are identified, a minimum of 2 examples should be prepared for trialing. I know that that's really hard, but I would say that's best practice. You don't want to just trial one device and never have a comparison. When trialing technology, do it with tasks that are below the child's ability level whenever possible. So we want to make sure that we're choosing really, really easy, fun tasks for the student to do when we're trialing technology, because we don't want to be testing, their ability to do a task. We want to be testing how well the technology does or doesn't work for them. Not having access to technology in district is not an excuse not to trial it. There's lots of ways to get creative about this. There's vendors of technology that you can talk about, possibly trialing a device with. Every state has a assistive technology project that might be able to loan you devices. So bringing the team together and getting creative, just because the technology doesn't already exist in district, doesn't mean that you can't consider it for the student. And then it's also important to remember that there's no magic wand tool that will solve all the problems. Students with CVI need a toolkit of tools and strategies like any other child with a visual impairment. There's no right process for conducting an assistive technology assessment. The process that I have laid out is a suggestion. Every team needs to come up with what works for them.
Find other videos in this series on assistive technology and CVI, and learn more about CVI at cvinow.org.